learning design patterns, especially early on in your career, I think is super important because not only will you become more familiar with the terminology that is often used to describe a lot of the code that you'll probably interact with, but I think it'll help you become a better developer in general. If you become familiar with common design patterns, let's say the repository pattern, factory patterns, dependency injection, and just whatever other design pattern you want to throw out there. I think it's going to help you to, I think, put to words what you're trying to do in the code and what you intuitively think should happen, because I feel like, at least from my experience, is that sometimes when you're thinking through a solution to a problem in code, you it's hard to articulate what it is you're thinking and what you're trying to do. And if you have a broad familiarity with design patterns that honestly stem from the late 80s to today, I think it'll help put words to what you're trying to say. Design patterns are not a protocol in a sense, right? They're more of a, here's a suggestion on how to structure your code to accomplish this goal. And that's really where the power comes in, because it's not something you have to do, right? There's a lot of options when it comes to whatever design pattern you choose. And a lot of these design patterns have stemmed from people's problems, and somebody made a solution to solve a problem. So it's probably safe to assume that the problem you're running into has probably been run into before, and somebody's put a little bit of thought into it and created some kind of pattern around it. And so, if we can talk about one, the repository pattern, this is probably going to be a really, really powerful one for you to know early on in your career, because it's such a common way, at least in the .NET world, that you're going to see interactions to and from the database. And it just acts as a layer to separate out your database calls from any kind of, you know, service layer. And that's really all it is. It's just, think about it as, you have your directory. It's just a folder in that directory, and their files, and in the files is just code to communicate with the database, and that's really about it. And you'll see some variation on that, but the nice thing about design patterns, or at least a lot of them, is just the sheer simplicity of them. And I feel like some people try to overcomplicate it, but it's not there to complicate things. It's there really to make it simple. Now, you could argue that some design patterns, like especially decorator patterns, can get out of hand pretty quick because they start adding stuff, on requests or doing stuff like that. You could argue with that. I get that one. How about we amend our statement to say some design patterns are designed for simplicity. I'm not knocking decorator patterns, but I'm just saying that some of them can get a little crazy. But we need to look at code as a tool for us, right? And if design patterns help us to craft a language that other people are going to understand, I think that warrants a look at whatever pattern you choose to do. And I really think, though, that getting back to the repository pattern, I think that is one that you'll probably want to know, because it's so prevalent especially in the .NET world. That is pretty much the way commonly that you're going to see a separation of files, and to communicate with a database. I mentioned dependency injection because that's pretty much universal across the board in terms of how a class gets its dependency. And it's basically just there to avoid you calling, the in .NET or C# the new word to create a new instance, right? Let's just let the middleware, the dependency pipeline, or service registration as we call it, take care of that. So on construction, basically we start with the root composition of our application, and then it just kind of goes down there in a list of basically nodes. And it creates a way for us to mock our services easier, but it also creates better loose coupling. Because if you mess with the dependency, you don't break something that uses it because it's built on interfaces. And so I feel like when you start to really dissect a lot of these design patterns, you're going to see some underlying principles kind of stem out of them. One of them being to code to an interface, right? I don't care what book you read about software development, you'll probably read something about coding to an interface and the advantages of abstraction through interfaces. And it's just something that it's just been figured out. And I think that that really is the power of learning design patterns early on, because you figure out the thought processes that have gone into these problems that have been around for a while and how they have been solved and in different ways that they have been solved, right? Because there's never one really like there's never just like one solution a lot of times. Sometimes there's multiple. And design patterns are fun because it lets you I think it takes some of the pressure off coding in a sense, because once you kind of have words to like or a framework as to how you're going to structure your application, and once you kind of have like the backing of like a solid knowledge base of how it has been done in the back of your mind, you gain so much more confidence to go and tackle the problem, because you worry less about how to do it, and you just like have some you just know how to implement it, and that's a really good feeling. And I a lot of times, like, the more I've gone through just like tutorials on languages and frameworks, like, yeah, I understand the syntax maybe a little bit more, but I found that it doesn't help me a lot of times with my overall confidence to code inside of a system, inside of a full solution, because I was lacking that design pattern foundation. But once I added that into my knowledge of languages and frameworks, that really helped me, because it just added something that I could use to put to words what I was thinking in terms of code. And so, obviously there's kind of key books out there for design patterns. Um, the one is Elements of what was it called? Design Patterns by uh, what's the full title? I'm like looking at like the book back there. It's Design Patterns. It's if you type in Design Patterns by the Gang of Four, you'll see it. I think it was written in 1994. But it talks about like just object oriented designs, and that's pretty much been the foundational textbook for design patterns since it's been published. So I would start with that one, and then a good one in .NET if you're going to read is there's I found a really good one about microservice design patterns, and it kind of I feel like it's a pretty succinct book, but it fleshes out a lot of really solid patterns in an easy to follow way. So I'll try to find the title of that one, and put it in the description, as well as the design patterns book. But there's a lot of information out there. But when it comes to design patterns, you you probably you probably should not be surprised if you find a lot of like quote unquote like old like resources from the 80s or 90s, because these design patterns is not a new topic. It's been around for a while, and so don't be afraid to read something from like the 90s and feel like it's irrelevant, because it's probably still very relevant, because the underlying principle of the design pattern pretty much applies across the board to any object oriented programming language like C Sharp or Java. Um, so let me know what y'all think about design patterns, or if you have any other good books or resources about the topic. So that's all I got for today. I'll see you in the next one.